I'm going to throw out a question to the entire panel. I think David and Jonathan already touched on this in your presentations. But what did you guys consider when you were choosing your tech stacks? What are the suitability things that you thought about, positives, negatives of all the technology and infrastructure platforms that are out there?
Well, I'll start by saying, so a lot of these projects so far, well, for starters, a lot of stuff being done is proof of concepts. I mean, I'm actually from the research arm of Hitachi. There's a reason why this isn't like just a productionized business unit yet, and that is because these are still sort of evolving, emerging technologies. And part of what we're figuring out is what is the best way to deploy it. But I'll also throw out, it's not just building the stack, it's how do you operate it. And one of the jokes I like to make is if you go to, say, the operations department of, say, a bank, and you say, hey, I'm going to deploy a new system based on SQL Server or Oracle, they're like, great, we know how to manage it, back it up, if we need to add capacity to it, we can manage its performance. How do we do all those same things with a blockchain system if you give us one of those? And these are some of those best practices around running them in production are important things to figure out. So these are all factors when figuring out how to put it together. Right now there's a lot of one-off stuff going on, but I think it's starting to congeal where there are some more standardized architectures for different approaches, and certainly all the different projects under the Hyperledger umbrella are sort of helping standardize some of those approaches.
Yeah, so for us, in a similar way, but it also depends on I think it depends on the use case, for sure. It also depends on us on the sophistication of the customer. Like if somebody comes to us and he knows exactly what he wants, or I would like to have a wallet in Ethereum that goes to this and have some ERC20 token, say, okay, you're in a different space. We're like here trying to kind of have a regulated business where basically I know who the validators are, so when the transaction is actually getting written to the blockchain, I actually know who are the guys that endorsing a transaction, right? If I use the Fabric terms, right? If I look at an open network, then it's a different world, right? If I look at Bitcoin, sorry if I'm going to insult some people, but the miners are running the show. It's okay, but if you want censorship resistance, that's one aspect of blockchain that you should use. If you want something that is a little bit more compliant, and if you want to basically have a global payment that will not, get the regulators so angry, then I would go in a different way. So now we have a lot of technology stacks. To be honest, we're still in kind of the early days because they're not talking so well together. So it really depends on the sophistication, the use case, and what you really want to achieve in the short term and long term. And I think the biggest problem that we see now that many kind of projects are getting stuck in the POC stage is because they didn't really define the use case from the business side. People are not really used to, and it's true, by the way, in the open kind of permissionless world and also in enterprise, businesses are not used to sharing all this information all the time. Because if you have a sector-based chain, and I see it in Fabric and I see it in different places, basically your peers are sometimes your competitors. So if I have hospitals sharing healthcare records, these healthcare records are of the clients of each hospital. Why would they share it, right? So we really need to change the mindset from the business side in order to use blockchain correctly. So I need to see how likely the people in front of us are going to change their ways. Yeah. So.
Hanna, did you have any?
Sure. So I totally agree with the statement of making sure that use case is fit, first before we would engage. Because first of all, the first question, do you need blockchain or distributed ledger technology at all? So then second question, if you do, because there's certain synergies or you can remove reconciliation costs or you can actually create immutable records that will be valuable for auditors afterwards. Then we go to the next step. Okay, what's technologies out there that are most ready and that are actually fit for this use case? So as I mentioned, we did have experience working, for example, with Ethereum, where we used it for crowdfunding platforms, and that made sense. At the same time, for all of the enterprise use cases that we've built so far, Hyperledger Fabric was most fit, in our opinion. And really, also the governance and community that Hyperledger has are very important, because you also want to make sure that once you go further, not only from technology standpoint, but also from licensing standpoint, that everything is properly taken care of. And Linux Foundation is providing all the necessary governance elements.
Thank you. Hart, I saw you nodding your head.
Yeah, I was going to follow up on that and agree with what Hanna said here. The Hyperledger governance and open source model are extremely important to us. This gives us confidence that something will be there down the road. We can invest resources building on Hyperledger because we have confidence in this governance long term. So that's a really big thing for us.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what's been said already in terms of use cases and make sure it's actually an actual use case for blockchain implementation. When it comes to protocols, for us, it's really, we want to be open, right? Because we have a lot of customers. Maybe our customers want to start a blockchain project or a consortia, but at the end of the day, it will also happen that they might be asked to join an existing one, right? So we kind of have to have the flexibility and cannot say, okay, we only support one protocol, otherwise you have to go somewhere else. Because again, I think a lot of things what our customers are looking at into is really the integration at the end, right? Because they have those big systems already that are oftentimes SAP, and they say, okay, I have this data here, and now I have to open this up or connect, so help me, right? So that's why we're really looking into different protocols. Nevertheless, I think, yeah, the open source is crucial here. I mean, we talk to a lot of smaller companies that come to us and say, look, we have a better protocol than Hyperledger and other things, but it's really hard to get behind something like this because Hyperledger has already 200 companies or something behind it, right? Yeah. So you have this kind of critical mass here already. Nevertheless, we really look, depending on the use case, do you need smart contracts, do you not need smart contracts, and then really make a decision.
And I think many people don't know this, but IBM started working with Ethereum. When we did our first projects, we did it on Ethereum because that's what was there. But we quickly ran into some issues, the license, the ability to scale, a variety of different things. And as we thought about what businesses were going to need, you need to have a modular, pluggable approach to blockchain because this is going to be systems of record live forever. The banks that run your bank accounts have probably had their systems in place for 30 to 40 years. And because this ledger is going to exist forever, you need to design it in such a way that you can update it and change it and future-proof it, but still keep the integrity of what you've built. And that's part of what IBM has done with the IBM blockchain platform, is taking that open source core and making it much easier to develop your applications, set up the governance, not only at the technology level, but at the solution level, because ultimately you have to deal with data governance and a variety of other things. And then to David's point, to operate it. How do you now have lots of different organizations that are running nodes, and your security is only as good as your weakest link, right? And so you need to make sure that you are really managing all of those components.
Really good point. The other question that has come up is so Brian talked a lot about what Hyperledger is, where the technology is. Where are we today in terms of maturity of that technology, and where can it go? What are the future use cases?
You want to do the same?
Sure.
So, well, it's interesting, because I worked on Bitcoin before, and then when I moved to Ethereum, we were like, oh, so now that's it, you're not fighting. Because in Bitcoin, we always have this kind of, the Twitter wars, right? Adam Beck and all these guys. It's like years of kind of pushing and fighting over block size and whatnot, right? So Bitcoin is trying to be kind of the more mature kind of decision-making platform that really tries to kind of stay open as much as they can in their own kind of Bitcoin world, right? Ethereum is trying to do something that is more kind of accessible to developers. So I think that Ethereum is doing better in terms of development community, to be very honest. Even though Hyperledger has a project now that basically gives you an EVM that is compliant with Ethereum, we still don't have the same traction. So we have a lot of developers in the enterprise space. So we talk all the time. We're consulting, we're teaching, we're training. So we get a lot of kind of people that are trying to use Hyperledger Fabric or all the Hyperledger technologies in the enterprise space. But it's not the same as kids trying to get into blockchain and they start to build stuff up. At the same time, if you do need, this is what I mentioned before, the IBM kind of cloud or the IBM blockchain platform, if you do need SLAs, if you need to have global replications, if you need to have backups, it's not something that I can run on my own, just getting a few Heroku instances and just run something. It's okay, it's gonna work, but if you think about it, I like to think about it this way. Today, nobody is thinking about hosting their own website, right? You don't have your own server and you keep it up and wake up in the middle of the night and it's still on, right? You hand it over, right? It can be SAP, it can be IBM, it can be Microsoft, it can be AWS, it doesn't matter. It matters, it depends on your features, but it doesn't matter. The kind of mode of operandi is basically you just give it away to somebody that will manage that. Now, if you're asking me about kind of the maturity, I think we it was a tough one for us as a startup at the beginning because we really wanted to stop doing POCs just for the sake of learning stuff because we're a team of cryptographers, ex-military stuff. So we like the crypto and we like the technology sometimes too much, to be honest. And we try to kind of really have like this business model of we are really trying to really get you to production. So when we started working with like real users, real devices, real sensors, real data, that's actually becoming like serious, then we had to run into all the compliance issues. And then we had to solve the business problem. So I think the technology is getting more and more mature. You can do stuff in Hyperledger Fabric. People are deploying. The IBM announced like recently, 400 customers. So all this stuff was kind of, so we have some NDAs and stuff. So we are aware of some deals, but we didn't realize the scale. But at the same time, I think we still have a lot to do. I think we still have to do a lot of work in terms of identity. So how do I store stuff on the blockchain in an immutable way? How do I really kind of preserve my privacy? Because the thing is not just to find a legal loophole like you do in an ICO today, that it's not a security, it is security, it's a utility. The problem with privacy that you're going to have is that once it's out there, think about it this way, right? I have an append-only log file. It doesn't matter how it's stored. It's a Merkle tree, and I have some logs, I have some records. But effectively, if you look at Facebook, right, once I write something as a transaction on any blockchain, Ethereum, Bitcoin, Corda, it doesn't matter, on any DLT, actually. Basically, I don't have an unlike button, right? I already liked something. And then, yeah, I like it, and maybe the UI will show me that I don't like it. But everybody saw that I liked it, right? So this problem actually needs to really change from the business side. We have to stop thinking about we're just digitizing stuff. If we really want to decentralize things, I think the business side has to be a little bit more mature as well. So you have to spend more time with advisories, legal, accounting firms, to really understand the use case and see how you share it in a sharing economy. It's not going to be just the technology. So you can run stuff today on Ethereum, on Fabric. We have some other projects in Hyperledger that actually are production ready. They're 1.0, and you can run real systems. But to really move the books and records and the official system and end of day, risk in a bank to these systems will take more time because they're still missing features in terms of privacy, scalability, all the stuff that I'm talking about, identity. And later on, we are going to have a lot of the transactions are not, so I don't want to put everything on Venmo.
Wait, but I have to jump in. I have to jump in on the technology.
Okay.
So I think what's really important is we've just gotten to 1.1. Fabric is 1.1 released today. Mm-hmm. So that's pretty cool. Yeah, right? And I think what we're doing is with each iteration, we're seeing new capabilities, new requirements, the technology is improving. I mean, if you look at what the community is talking about for the roadmap, there's a lot of actually really exciting stuff that the traditional crypto community would recognize. They're talking about zero-knowledge proofs for confidential transactions. We're looking at native asset models because it's not that you have to have. It's not that you, the point of Hyperledger is that you don't need the cryptocurrency to operate because of a variety of factors. Doesn't mean there aren't use cases where tokens are fully appropriate and necessary to incentivize the ecosystem, to trade assets, etc. So I think that there's, David mentioned the point of convergence, and at IBM we're working on a variety of different things, but also looking at how do you get on-ramps onto and off of public networks, because that is going to be, kind of a key need in the future. We have a solution that actually does that. So I think the technology is going in a really interesting way, and Hyperledger is working hard to make, there are 9 projects, right? And to start to pull different pieces. So they're making Burrow work with Fabric, right? Getting Composer to potentially work with multiple projects. Lots of different projects are looking at Indy for the identity piece. So I think what we're going to see, the incentives have been for, rather than getting to convergence, it's been create your own protocol, because you can start your own token and you can become a billionaire. But long term, we're going to see the consolidation, and we're going to see certain types of technologies that are driving in a certain direction, and we're going to have to unify around standards for those.
Yeah. And I think that a big point is going to be, we're going to need interoperability between blockchains, right? If you're running some Hyperledger instance, you're probably going to want it to be able to communicate and even transact with things like Ethereum or Bitcoin. And there are some efforts already in this direction, like Interledger, for instance. but we haven't really seen a huge push towards this. And I think this will be one of the next big things people realize and start to put a lot of effort in.
And I think that this is a 1.x technology. There are going to be early adopters that are okay, that are comfortable, that understand the shortcomings of an early stage software project and are willing to take those risks because they want the first mover advantage. The odd thing sort of about a lot of these systems, though, is that if you look at use Swift as an example, for right now, all the world's banks are connected to Swift. They all use Swift. So R3 comes along and says, well, we have a better approach to this. So there's first movers, but the problem is, unless there's critical mass, unless there are enough banks on the network, there isn't value in being the first adopter. There needs to be more than one. So I think you're going to see these fits and starts of where there are consortium approaches to an early adopter is going to drag along some of its supply chain or frequent trading partners to say, you need to join us to sort of build that critical mass. So I think that's going to, versus some other technologies that companies could deploy all on their own, this is going to cause a little bit of a delay in terms of how this technology gets adopted, but it does frustrate me a little bit when I see people like, oh, Bitcoin's already a bunch of years old. Why isn't more companies fully deployed, and why isn't everything in the world running on this? And I'm like, it's just a new technology. You need to sort of have reasonable expectations for the rate of adoption across enterprises, especially, I would say, in the financial services world, where there's this really high threshold for uptime and stability and accuracy. So it's coming. We're optimistic about it. I just think it's going to take some more time till, maybe in about 3 or 4 years, we'll be talking about a couple of major corporations that have it fully up and running, and then we'll be talking about more of the benefits of it.
Yeah.
Sorry, not to jump in one more time, but what we are seeing is those early adopters are getting it going. I mean, we've got, I think, 220 networks that are going, and probably, many more that are coming, and a handful of those that are actually using it for production use cases. So it's early, but the pieces are there to actually do this, and so I think it tends to be more on the human side. People don't know, how do we do governance? How do we do security?
Yeah.
How do we share data? Who owns it? And I think those are the questions that are going to slow this down for the whole community.
No, but that's what I meant by the business side, right? People need to come in and use the technology correctly. The fact that you can, so we run Fabric in production, IBM run Fabric in production, people run some enterprise Ethereum in production. But the question is, do we really get a critical mass of 100 companies using it? Do we really have instead of us using Uber and Lyft, and we have a blockchain with, a two-sided network where, the producer and the consumers are talking to each other without an intermediary? It will take some time. We see it, and it's working, and, it's growing, but yeah.
Who's pitched disintermediating Lyft and Uber? Is that what I just heard?
Well, we're not supporting an ICO in but yes.
Well, speaking of enterprise, also we see exactly to run it in production, there's a lot of parties that have to come together, and specifically there's a need also to address the question for the networks when failure is not an option. Right, when billions of dollars are moving through the network, or when it's mission-critical systems in enterprise. And for that purpose, we also look, okay, how do we integrate with existing systems to ensure the smooth transition? As technology matures, we can run it for specific limited number of processes, and as technology rolls out with the necessary functionality to really go and transition from old processes to totally new processes, because in enterprise, greenfield approach just doesn't work. You can start with a startup and build everything from scratch. In enterprise, you have a lot of responsibility towards your customers to ensure that it works.
Yeah, customers definitely have that expectation, it has to be enterprise grade before we run it in production. And there's all those questions we just discussed, like governance around it. The owning part, I think, is also a bigger one, right? Is someone really owning it, or can we really get to this fully decentralized, even governance around this topic? So those are some of the questions we are also looking into, and as well as business models, right? Can we use tokens as a business model with even in a consortia blockchain, or is there any other business models or incentives we can use? There's still quite a few challenges out there.
the one thing, though, is we keep talking about enterprise, but it's not just about these really big companies, right? It's about enabling the whole ecosystem of developers and other companies, other people, other organizations that want to interact with those large organizations, right? So it's, you know, it's really critical, and Hyperledger has projects like Composer, which make it very easy for a JavaScript developer to be able to figure out, okay, let me model out my assets, my participants, and my transactions. So rather than having to get really deep into the technology, they can come at it at a much higher level. So that's first. And the second is, you know, we're about to release a starter plan on Monday that'll make it really easy for anyone to figure out how this technology works, get it started, and understand the different pieces. And I think you have to look at enterprises not just like these big, giant corporations, but actually they're the enablers of the economy that allow everyone. I mean, we expect the lights to go on, we expect our Uber to arrive at the time it says it's going to, et cetera. So I think it's really important to look at it. It really is much more holistic than that.
I'm less worried about the big enterprises because they have resources and teams who can look into this, right? But at the end of the day, to make it work end-to-end, let's say in a logistics, you have like a small trucking company who has like a couple of trucks, farmers, exactly. How do you connect those, right? Because ultimately, you even rely on that data, right? Because everything else up the chain really relies on that first input of data, and how do you make this work?
Absolutely.
Really great point. So that actually leads up to my last question, which is there's always been a little bit of tension between the enterprise side and the open source, you know, community, the public. What do you think each party can learn from each other?
So I can tell you what happened to me, right? When I moved kind of from the Bitcoin to Ethereum, we would say, hey, you're just going for the money. Because Ethereum had like, we bought ETH at like the pre-sale, right? And then later on, no, we started to really build stuff on top. And then when we started working with IBM Research and kind of after I started releasing I was the release manager of 1.0, people really told me, look, Jonathan, I really believe that you are like seriously part of the Illuminati. Because now you work with all these big guys, and we thought you were a friend, right? You go in the blockchain, and I said, guys, the fact that you have an enterprise-grade open source solution is not a bad thing. Just go and learn from what we did there, right? So it's all in the open, right? So nobody's going to, because I was afraid at the time, right? Because what happens? Are we creating like a master that is going to take over the world? And actually, the licensing is very easy. So you can use any of the Hyperledger kind of project, because it's Apache 2.0. You can wrap it, you can brand it, you can use it whatever you like, and you have a perpetual kind of right to use this IP. Nobody's going to chase you. IBM and all the companies around contributing all the kind of patents to the community. I don't know about Ethereum didn't want to change the license back in the day, but I think like we're kind of in a nice intersection, right, between kind of being super cool and like do whatever you want, but then at the same time the regulated stuff and really working with like real data that has to be sensitive and stored. I think this tension is gonna at some point disappear or at least fade, because we see more and more kind of connectivity now between using the technology that started in the public and permissionless, and then people feeling now the need to really have the permissioning, right? We did membership services in Fabric for a reason, right? You cannot put everything in the open. You have to know who is logging onto the network. You need to have like the access control to the data. So now the permissionless guys are saying, oh, actually, you know, companies really need these features. And then we are learning from the community. Look, I'm judging Ethereum panels and hackathons, and I'm active in Casper now. So we see kind of this, the kind of the both kind of trying to solve the same problem from a different angle. And I think that in a year or two, we're not going to have this dichotomy of either public permissionless or kind of permissioned and running stuff in silo. We're already, yeah.
Hart really wants to jump in.
I guess. So I was just going to point out that, you know, in real life, you trust a lot of people in a lot of organizations, and you might not trust one person unilaterally, but, you know, if there are a lot of people, you know, maybe several banks agree on something, you know, maybe you can trust them. So permissioned or semi-permissioned blockchains often kind of utilize this trust that you do have and exploit it to, you know, offer you advantages that you wouldn't necessarily be able to achieve with a public blockchain.
Sorry, no, keep going.
And I was going to say, as far as enterprise and open source, I think enterprises are very, very happy to accept open source. One of the reasons Hyperledger was started is because kind of lots of people were building their own blockchains. And if I want to build a blockchain application, it makes it very hard if there are tons and tons of different blockchains that I have to make my application work on. So I think probably we'll see some convergence to some kind of like TCP IP layer for blockchain.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the blockchain has been sort of cast in religious terms, practically. I mean, I was talking to a true believer who said, I'm absolutely a true believer. But then he said, but then I raised $40 million in cryptocurrency, and I can't get my assets into fiat, and so I have a cash flow problem, right? And that's the reality. And so I think there is a lot that the kind of more enterprise style of blockchain can bring to the open cryptocurrency world, and vice versa. And as I mentioned before, we're already pulling stuff from the open chains, zero knowledge proofs, et cetera, into what we're doing. So I think we're actually, as was said before, there's a lot more in common than I think people realize.
Yeah, and I'll add that things have changed in the corporate world in terms of how they approach software. I was at ING Direct back in 2007, and I think we were the first U.S. bank to head down the road of using officially open source software. And at that point, we wanted to use Apache and Linux, which lots of other kind of businesses were already using. But in banking, everything was vendor-driven. And the idea of open source now, even in banking and other industries, is common. And I think that what you're seeing now is the platforms that would have been built by a singular company, and they would have competed at the platform level. The competition within companies these days is at the application level, the use case level. And if you don't have sort of this conformity and mature platform, you can't build any of those things. And certainly in a networked environment like blockchain systems, you need that open source. So, kudos to IBM that they had been building this and then turned it over to the Linux Foundation. And obviously, lots of other companies have jumped on board to say, yes, this is the right approach to build sort of that enterprise-grade system, and we'll all see each other on the battlefield of applications.
Yeah.
Well said.
Well, I have I always have something to say, so every time you ask, I'm going to say something. So. The one thing I want to say, just because it's token fest, right? The fact that we are doing stuff in a regulated way, and yes, I agree that there are many use cases where we don't need a token, and people are trying to kind of sometimes bake into a token that doesn't make sense. My personal advice, and I've been in banking for years, and I've been doing credit in the credit crisis, in Goldman Sachs during like a lot of kind of distress. My suggestion to everybody here, it doesn't matter what you do, try not to piss off the regulator, because no, really, like if they want KYC, if they want AML, and if they want to know who is buying what and where the money is coming from, where it's going, there's no point in trying to circumvent it. It's just a matter of time. So I wouldn't treat kind of the delay in execution of something as a lack of action. It will come back. So just stay safe, stay legal, and enjoy it. Yeah.
Thank you for that last comment. So now we have enterprises using blockchain technology successfully. Thank you very much.